Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, as part of my ongoing series covering Baldur's Gate 3 itemization, we're talking about amulets, specifically the amulets available in Act 3. In Part 1 and 2 of this tier list, I looked at the amulets available in Acts 1 and 2, and we discovered that Amulet is probably the most flexible and variable gear slot in the game, the one that you're going to change most often. That's because amulets often have powerful but circumstantial abilities, which means that you can swap them in and out for different encounters. And because of that incredible variety and utility, amulets let you shore up the weaknesses of your builds or your parties without having to invest any resources in doing so. That theme is going to continue on into Act 3, so being able to know which ones of these are useful and which aren't, and which ones you should keep an eye on for when they're going to be that clutch moment that snatches victory from the jaws of defeat, is going to be very helpful. By this point, you know how we're rating the tiers. I have talked about how we are organizing the tiers, what each tier means, and how we're organizing the ratings. And of course, for a more detailed explanation of that, you can refer to part 1 of this tier list. So let's just get right into it and start talking amulets. First up, the Amulet of Windrider. This lets you cast Gust of Wind once per short rest, and Ride the Winds, which is just a renamed version of Gaseous Form, once per long rest. So basically you get a level 3 spell slot once per long rest and a level 2 spell slot once per short rest to cast Gust of Winds and to cast Gaseous Form. I think both of those spells are somewhat underrated, because Gaseous Form is actually a fairly powerful ability. You can use it to bypass a lot of out-of-combat exploration events. You can fit through bars or gaps in a fence, for example. You can even use it to pass through a fence and fight enemies from the other side of it, which can be pretty dangerous to melee enemies who then won't have an option to follow you. You can also use it to hover safely over dangerous surfaces, so it can be used to bait enemies into bad positions. There's a lot of cool uses for Gaseous Form. Gust of Wind is a big knockback, which is pretty useful in some scenarios. It's a large AoE. It's not affected by Sanctuary, which makes it useful for one encounter in particular in Act 3. So there's definitely some opportunities that having these spells gives you. However, these spells are pretty easily duplicated. Potions of Gaseous Form are much more interesting than casting it as an action, because the potions you can use as a bonus action, and it's not like you need so many casts of Gaseous Form that you're going to run out of potions. There will be plenty of potions for you to do the things that you want to do with Gaseous Form throughout the game. It's a powerful spell, but one that's so situational that I just don't think you're going to run out of that resource and need to actually cast the spell. And if you do, of course, you can always actually prepare it and spend a spell slot on it. Similarly, Gust of Wind is such a situational spell that equipping an amulet to be able to use it in combat is just not something that I would recommend. You can carry scrolls of it and use a scroll of Gust of Wind to as a much more efficient way to gain that effect in the very narrow circumstances where it arises. If you have a strategy that's sort of predicated around constantly being in Gaseous Form, maybe hovering inside an Evard's Black Tentacles while Gaseous Form so enemies can't get at you and you have resistance to damage and stuff, then the Amulet of Windrider could maybe have some use, and it does give you a bunch of casts of spells, so it can save you some resources. I'll give it C tier because it's not totally useless, but the Amulet of Windrider is just duplicated too easily by other sources of these effects, and these aren't effects that you just want all the time, so any source of them is fine. The Absolute Confidence Amulet. This is kind of a joke item. It gives you +1 to performance and -1 to intimidation. And it's intended to be funny, because it's a quest reward for doing something funny, more than it's intended to actually be useful for the player. So from that perspective, it definitely succeeds. I really enjoy the flavor of this amulet. I guess much as Gale might. But the Absolute Confidence Amulet isn't something that you're actually going to use. It's just there for flavor. +1 to performance could potentially be useful in some very narrow circumstances, but you can pretty safely just send this one back to camp and then have a chuckle whenever you see it, rather than having to actually worry about equipping it. D tier. the Amulet of Bhaal. The Amulet of Bhaal gives you, whenever you hit a target, so with any attack, which actually does include spell attacks, it's just any attack, whenever you hit a target that has maximum hit points, they also gain bleeding. This is a no-save way to inflict bleeding on your attacks, which is actually pretty useful for some builds that care about having enemies bleed. In particular, the Trampler build, which uses Elk Totem Barbarian to apply bleed and maim in a big AoE, knock enemies prone, and stun them as a result. I kind of forgot about this item when I was making that build. This is a better way to apply bleed than the gloves, the flawed Helldusk gloves and the Helldusk gloves that I suggested in that build video, because those have a saving throw and the Amulet of Bhaal doesn't. So for some very specific builds that require bleed synergy, this is a way to apply it without a saving throw that's actually pretty powerful. For Tiger Heart Barbarians, which are the most common character that cares about bleeding, you don't need it because you already inflict bleeding with your attacks. But for any other character that has a bunch of bleed synergies, and there's a lot of those in the game, and some of them are very powerful, most particularly the maim effect from the Wolverine Barbarian animal aspect, this is going to be a pretty powerful tool in your arsenal that can help you lock down enemies right from the beginning of combat. An enemy who is bleeding and maimed can't move, so and that's exactly what you want when they were previously full health, because that means that on what is probably the first turn of the combat, they aren't going to do anything relevant, and that's the most important time to take them out. The bleed lasts for 2 turns also when you inflict it on them with the Amulet of Bhaal, so you get 2 turns worth of being able to hit them with a maim effect, and that's usually going to be plenty. And if it's not, then you have other ways to inflict bleed available in your party, but for the most part, they will be bleeding during the most relevant parts of the fight for them to be bleeding. Obviously, most builds don't care about this because it's a relatively narrow condition, but for bleed synergy builds, this is pretty good. I'm going to give it B tier because it is a very, very specific subset of builds that want the Amulet of Bhaal, but for those builds, I think this one's actually definitely worth looking at. The Amulet of Elemental Torment. The Amulet of Elemental Torment, this is a funny one, because this used to be an Act 1 item. It used to be available in Act 1 in the Githyanki Crèche, but was moved to very late in Act 3 after one of the most difficult encounters in the game, and I don't really know why. This would be really fun as an Act 1 item, and indeed was fun as an Act 1 item, with a lot of cool tactical possibilities. As an Act 3 item, it's a lot less interesting. But what it does is it gives you, whenever you're standing in a damaging surface, particularly, it works on only specific kinds of surfaces, so fire, caustic brine, toxin, and acid, and only the most basic toxin, not the upgraded toxins. And then you cast a spell that deals damage, it applies the effect of that surface to the targets of the spell. So if you're standing in a fire and you hit an enemy with any damaging spell, doesn't have to be a fire spell, they also catch fire and take 1d4 fire damage immediately. Basically, if you are standing in a fire, if you light yourself on fire, this adds 1d4 fire damage to all of your damaging spells, which is really quite powerful and gives you a lot of additional options for doing cool stuff. The way it interacts with spells that have multiple damage instances, like Eldritch Blast or Scorching Ray, is a little odd. I have seen that if I fire like a 7-shot Scorching Ray while I stand in a patch of fire, it will sometimes do 2 or 3 instances of the fire damage, rather than either 1 or 7, as you might expect. I'm not exactly sure what governs that behavior, and maybe the fact that this item is buggy is why they decided to hide it behind a really late-game Act 3 quest, rather than let you get it early on. But this is a pretty powerful effect. Adding a d4 to all of your damage spells doesn't sound like much, but it's pretty easy to trigger this just by standing in any poison or fire surface, and you can also stand in any acid surface to reduce enemies' armor class by 2, which is at the cost of reducing your own, of course, which is pretty nice. The other thing about this amulet is that you can still use it even if you're immune to the effects of the surface. So if you have the boots that make you immune to acid surfaces, you can use this to add -2 armor class to all of your Eldritch Blasts, for example, which is a pretty nice rider effect to add on top of your Eldritch Blasts. Or plus 1d4 damage to all of your spells if you stand in a fire and are either wet or immune to burning in some way. So the Amulet of Elemental Torment is a really cool item, enables a lot of interesting strategies. It's weird they decided to move it so late in the game, where it's much less relevant, and I wish they hadn't done that, because this is one I'd really like to have spent more time playing with when it was available early in the game. But the Amulet of Elemental Torment, even on into the late game, is still kind of cool for some builds. Extra damage on your spells is just a very powerful thing to do, and it's a relatively easy condition to trigger. You just have to be in a fire. And so I'm going to give it B tier, because you will be able to get a decent amount of additional value from this on certain builds, and that's just a cool playstyle that this amulet enables. The Amulet of Greater Health. The Amulet of Greater Health sets your Constitution score to 23, giving you a +6 modifier to your Constitution saving throws and +6 hit points per level that you are, which over the course of 12 levels is going to be an additional 72 hit points that you get from your Constitution if you're wearing this amulet. It also gives you advantage on Constitution saves, which are mostly concentration checks, but also any spells or whatever that target your Constitution, you'll have advantage on those saves. Between having a +6 bonus and advantage on your Constitution saves, you're never going to fail a concentration check again if you're wearing this amulet, so it's amazing for spellcasters. Also, just getting 72 hit points for free without having to invest any build resources in them is amazing for any character. Somebody in your party is always going to be wearing this amulet. I should say that off the start. The difficult decision is going to be who, and I think usually the best pick is to put this on a spellcaster, but also there's some special synergy for certain characters that may want you to put it on a different one instead. For example, a monk barbarian multiclass can use this to dump wisdom a little bit and still have high armor class, because you're getting the armor class from Barbarian's Unarmored Defense, and that will allow you to have much higher armor class without having to invest a huge amount of build resources into wisdom for your monk. So that is one great option with a 1-level dip in Barbarian or a more extensive multiclass. The Amulet of Greater Health can really power up that character archetype. As well, just for a normal unarmored Barbarian, this is a lot of health and a lot of additional armor class as well. Mostly, I think this is going to go on spellcasters, or characters that just really need the attribute points, because this also, just like all the other items that set your attributes to a certain value, lets you dump Constitution to 8 and respec those points elsewhere. It doesn't get you feats back the way the Strength Elixirs or the Gloves of Dexterity do, because most characters aren't going to spend feats on increasing their Constitution, but it still gets you a ton of attribute points, which can be allocated elsewhere, boosting your saving throws, making you better at skills, and making you better at just doing stuff throughout the game, because you have higher attribute points. The Amulet of Greater Health, obviously this is an insane item that every character is going to want to, every party is going to want to use. The only difficult decision is deciding who to put it on, so S tier. The Amulet of the Devout. So the Amulet of the Devout is one reason why you might not want the Amulet of Greater Health on a spellcaster, because for some spellcasters, the Amulet of the Devout is going to be better, since it gives you a +2 bonus to your save DCs. A constant theme throughout these tier lists has been that increases to your spell save DCs are one of the very best things that items can give you. I mean, if there's one lesson I want you to take away from all of these tier lists, it's get initiative and get save DCs on your items and you'll be just fine. And the Amulet of the Devout gives you a +2 bonus, which is an incredible amount. Obviously, some characters are going to be using Arcane Acuity stacks and may not need the spell save DC bonuses, but for any that aren't, or for runs where you're not using that, this is one of the very best ways to increase your spell save DCs, and that's just one of the very most important things that a spellcaster can do. Succeeding on your spells, it's good. What more can I say? This also gives you an additional Channeled Divinity charge. So for a cleric, you can use your Channeled Divinity abilities once more per day. It recharges on a long rest. That's not a super important thing, but some Channeled Divinity abilities are pretty good, so having an extra use of them isn't terrible. Don't feel like this amulet has to go on a cleric, though, because the real bonus works for anyone. Also, the name of the effect that increases your Channeled Divinity charges is called God's Will, but written as one word, so I always read it as God's Will, like it's liquid made of gods, that you, I don't know, slop pigs with, and that's just funny to me. Aside from that, though, the Amulet of the Devout increases your spell save DCs. That's an amazing thing to do, so best in slot for any offensive caster, S tier. The Amulet of the Drunkard. The Amulet of the Drunkard gives you, when you're drunk, you regenerate 2d4 hit points per round, and you increase the duration of being drunk from the normal 2 rounds up to 5 rounds. So when you drink any booze with the Amulet of the Drunkard equipped, you get 5 turns of regenerating 2d4 hit points per turn. That's pretty efficient out-of-combat healing, but also actually pretty good for in-combat. 2d4 hit points per turn is a pretty relevant amount of healing, especially when combined with other healing, and it's per turn, so it's going to trigger any effects that care about healing. At this point in the game, obviously you can't combine it with the Broodmother's Revenge, because they use the same slot, but things that care about you healing will trigger off of the Amulet of the Drunkard healing. You can have the Reviving Hands to gain Bleed Ward on yourself, and you can bless yourself with the Whispering Promise. So you get a lot of potential value out of just having incidental healing going all the time. So healing over time is actually pretty good. This is going to average 25 hit points regained per drink that you drink, so it makes it pretty efficient out of combat as well. And importantly, in Act 3, there's also the Glass of Wine item. That's an alcohol that for some reason requires no action to consume. Most alcohol requires a bonus action to drink, just like every other potion, but that item for some reason requires no action to consume and will get you drunk. So you can activate the effects of this amulet without spending any action economy at all on it. Now, typically, of course, you can just drink the booze before entering combat, but that is a pretty relevant effect to have access to and gain some regeneration. This is a mostly defensive option. It will be part of any build that's trying to maximize being drunk, which actually is a reasonably powerful set of items that give you some decent options even on into the late game of Baldur's Gate. But actually, for any build, this can be pretty reasonable regeneration. Now, most defensive builds are going to prefer something like the Amulet of Greater Health that just gives you more HP, rather than activating this regeneration to make up that HP difference. But the Amulet of the Drunkard definitely is interesting for alcohol-based builds, and also not a terrible option for other builds. I think it falls into B tier because it does require some building around to get the most value out of it, but this is another one that is worth keeping an eye on, even though I put it in B tier. The Chancer's Carcanet. The Chancer's Carcanet gives you, once per long rest, you can use your reaction to make an attack roll or saving throw with advantage. By this point in the game, you should have much better sources of advantage on attacks. For one thing, you can always just hide before making an attack. So the Chancer's Carcanet is mostly going to be, you can use your reaction to gain advantage on a saving throw. Advantage on a saving throw once per day is pretty good, but the downside of the Chancer's Carcanet is that it does trigger before you see the result of the first roll, so you don't get to re-roll with advantage. It's not re-rolling your saving throw. You have to decide in advance whether you're going to try to make the save with advantage, which is definitely makes this much harder to use. It also eats your reaction, so it's not going to be useful for every character because some characters have pretty important reactions, and I'd much rather use my reaction to do like a counterspell or something and not have to make a saving throw in the first place most of the time. Once per long rest also does hold this item back a little bit while making saving throws with advantage is a pretty powerful effect. You have to like swap this in and out, and maybe it doesn't get used in a certain encounter, and then you've just had an item that doesn't really do anything for that encounter, equipped for that encounter, when you could have had a much more powerful amulet to give you just a passive benefit or a more active benefit that you choose to use proactively. Because this is almost purely a defensive item, eats an important resource, and only works once per day, I just don't think this one is worth spending too much effort on. I think this is a C-tier item, and you're better off just getting flat bonuses to your saving throws, or advantage on important saving throws passively and permanently, so that you don't have to use your reaction and a once-per-day resource in order to pass an important save. The Corvid Token. I want to be really clear, that's Corvid with an R. The Corvid Token allows you to polymorph into a dire raven. So basically you can turn into a bird. You have 13 hit points and a blind attack, but mostly it's just for flying movement, which is pretty useful if you aren't able to fly in another way. Once per long rest you can fly. It also gives you permanent feather fall, so you never take damage from falling, and an additional 5 feet of movement speed when jumping or flying, and that movement speed gets carried over if you are polymorphed or wild shape. So you can gain additional jump speed and flying speed when you're in a wild shape form that jumps or flies. And you get permanent feather fall, so you can't take falling damage, and if you need to, you can turn into a bird and flap around. Basically, this is the out-of-combat exploration amulet for a lot of characters, because Featherfall gives you the option to go a lot of places you wouldn't otherwise be able to, and being able to turn into a bird can get you into a lot of areas in Act 3 that you wouldn't otherwise be able to go into. So the Corvid Token definitely has a bunch of uses in terms of out-of-combat exploration. It's less useful at the point in the game where you get it, because by this point you have plenty of access to Featherfall potions or whatever, and you probably have enough access to out-of-combat mobility that you don't really need this item anyways. But the Corvid Token is, of course, excellent for one reason, and for one particular reason, which is that it works while you're wild-shaped. There's very, very few items in the game that work at all while you're wild-shaped, so for a druid, this is going to be the best-in-slot item, because if you're wild-shaping, then plus 5 feet of jump distance is pretty relevant, and you can't get any benefits from anything else anyways, so you might as well have the Corvid Token equipped. Both for the fact this gives you some options for moving around the map a little better, which I end up using this item in most of my playthroughs anyways, just because it makes a lot of stuff more convenient especially if you aren't doing illithid powers that run, so you don't have flying from other sources. It just makes moving around the map much easier and navigating things much easier, and Constant Featherfall lets you do a bunch of cool dumb tricks with moving around Baldur's Gate, which actually has a lot of verticality. But also, just for any wild-shaping druid, you're going to equip this because there's nothing else you can equip that gives you any relevant benefit, so the Corvid Token is going to be great. Now, you might prefer to have another amulet equipped if you aren't starting fights in wild shape, but if you're a character that just spends all of your time in wild shape, then you're going to want the Corvid Token. I think it's a small enough benefit while wild-shaped. 5 feet of jump distance is good, especially for the owlbear, but it's not like an amazing benefit. It's not like it gives you armor class or attacks or damage or anything along those lines. That I'm going to give it A tier, because druids may want a different amulet most of the time anyways, because the benefit of a different amulet on the first turn of combat before you enter wild shape might be better. Like if you have, for example, the Amulet of the Devout equipped, then the first spell that you cast before entering wild shape will have 2 higher DC, and that might still just be better than 5 extra jump distance while in wild shaped. But for builds that specifically intend to spend all of their time wild shaped, the Corvid Token is excellent. The Fey Semblance Amulet. The Fey Semblance Amulet gives you advantage on intelligence, wisdom, and charisma saves. So all the mental saves you get advantage on. Advantage on mental saving throws is great. You will often take Gnome as a race just for that benefit, because it's a pretty powerful benefit, and Gnomes get it. And that will prevent you from losing encounters because you get hit by a powerful debilitating effect and roll a natural 1 on your saving throw and just lose immediately. The Fey Semblance Amulet is one of the cheaper ways to do this, but basically the question is advantage on intelligence and charisma saves better than the once per day shield from the Amulet of the Harpers? Something like 95% of the mental saving throws you're going to make will be wisdom saves, not the other two. So the once per day shield from the Amulet of the Harpers is actually, I think, more relevant for a lot of characters. But if you are going into a fight where specifically you're making intelligent saving throws, usually against Illithids, then the Fey Semblance Amulet might be better. It's also just a powerful effect that a lot of characters can benefit from. Any character that is suffering in terms of their saving throws can use the Fey Semblance Amulet. I still think that you will generally prefer to boost your saving throws in terms of flat numerical increases rather than gain advantage on it from something like this, because advantage on saves is not like super difficult to come by. And specifically, Hero's Feast gives you advantage on wisdom saves as well. So the Fey Semblance Amulet does overlap with some other pretty powerful options. For that reason, I'm going to put it in B tier, because it will come in for certain encounters, and it does conflict a little with some other items that do the same or similar things, and powerful late-game spells that you would want anyways. So certain party compositions will get a decent benefit out of it, but other party compositions won't be able to use it, and it's a purely defensive benefit, so decent in some encounters, B tier. Khalid's Gift. Khalid's Gift gives you +1 to your wisdom, and that's your actual wisdom score, +1 to your wisdom, as well as the ability to cast Aid as a level 3 spell, so for +10 bonus hit points once per long rest. Like a lot of the other spells that grant aid, this one only functions for the caster, so you just gain 10 maximum hit points, basically, once per long rest, and that is a reasonable benefit, but not one that you're, like, super excited for in Act 3. You also, Jaheira has a unique effect with this necklace, where she cannot be cursed while wearing it, which mostly doesn't come up, but will prevent her from receiving some annoying Act 3 debuffs. But those are pretty easy to get rid of with a remove curse spell, so it's not going to significantly change the impact of this item. You don't have to equip it on Jaheira specifically to get the most out of it. The real benefit here is +1 wisdom, and this can basically buy you back a feat for a wisdom-based character, because you can hit 20 wisdom with 17 starting wisdom, and only 1 ASI, which lets you get back a feat to spend on something like Alert or Warcaster or whatever. A feat is a pretty powerful use of an item slot, getting back a whole feat to spend on Alert. And so some, especially multi-classed clerics, will really benefit, or druids, will really benefit from Khalid's Gift to be able to take all of the feats they need while still hitting their 20 wisdom mark. For monoclassed clerics or druids, this does compete with some of the other powerful items. You, of course, have to measure it against the Amulet of the Devout and the Amulet of Greater Health, both of which have more impact most of the time, unless you are multiclassing and really need those feats. So this basically lets you sort of even out difficult multiclasses that otherwise don't have the ASIs they need to max out their wisdom saves. For a lot of characters, it won't be particularly necessary, but for some, it's a lifesaver and really helps you get the most out of those characters. Because a multiclassed cleric or druid that only gets 2 feats gains such a huge benefit out of Khalid's Gift, I'm going to put it in S tier for those characters specifically, but for other characters, it's for monoclass characters and other characters, it's more like an A tier amulet. It's only for characters that really need to get an extra feat out of it that it goes into S tier. The Kill Collar. This is here really only for completionism's sake. This is an amulet that you can put on, and it gives a specific enemy the option to blow you up without a saving throw. You just die immediately if a certain story action takes place while you're wearing this amulet. Obviously, you're not going to do that. There's no sort of hidden advantage, as far as I'm aware, or Easter egg that involves wearing this amulet. All it is gives you a chance to get exploded, so D tier, only here because I wanted to be thorough. The Sentient Amulet. This is the very rare version of the Sentient Amulet, the purple version, that you get as a quest reward for one possible outcome of the Sentient Amulet quest, and it turns your blue Sentient Amulet into a purple version of it. The purple version of the Sentient Amulet gives you Shatter once per long rest, just like the blue version, but without the downside of potentially hitting you with Tasha's Hideous Laughter, so you just get a Shatter that you can cast once per long rest. It's also a level 3 cast of Shatter, so it does 4d8 thunder damage, rather than the normal 3d8 of the previous version of the Sentient Amulet. In addition, you also get Key Restoration once per long rest, which restores a number of key points equal to your martial arts die. The martial arts die for a monk is the amount of damage that your unarmed strikes do. It scales with your monk levels. So at high levels, this can be a d8 of key points gotten back, and that's pretty nice for a monk. The ability to cast Shatter once per long rest, even a level 3 version of Shatter, is not particularly impressive in Act 3. Shatter is no longer a spell that you are going to need to go out of your way to access, because it's really just for story events that you would want it in earlier acts. So in Act 3, having once per long rest Shatter is both much easier to do through scrolls and so on, but also much less impactful. But restoring a bunch of key points does give your monks some additional longevity, so there is that. This is basically an item that you swap in if you're a monk and need to operate with more key points. Monks in Act 3 tend to not have to do this, though, because key points at that level are basically infinite. Monks are not going to run out of key points unless you're doing quite long adventuring days, or short resting very, very frequently. So the chances of this coming up, unless you're doing really long adventuring days, are actually not super high. Your monk is probably not going to be your first character to run out of resources, so it's not typically the source of needing to rest for your party. I'm going to give this B tier because swapping it in to regain key points is definitely still valuable if you've spent a lot of them in an encounter. But overall, this is not going to dramatically change how your character plays out because monks usually have enough key points. For a heavily multi-class character, it can be more useful just to give you a few extra key points that you might not have as many of, but even then, you generally will be able to sustain yourself pretty well just normally as a monk. The Spell Savant Amulet. The Spell Savant Amulet gives you one extra level 2 spell slot. So you can use this to put it on, cast a level 2 spell, take it off, and you've effectively gotten a free level 2 spell. That could be a day-long buff, it could be a spell that you use in combat, whatever. The amulet also works if you pass it from character to character. You can gain one additional spell per long rest per character. So if you have a full party of spellcasters, this could be 4 extra spell slots. You can also, I guess, use it to maximize the spell slots of your camp casters or whatever. Overall, at this point in the game, you have plenty of better sources for additional spell slots and for restoration of spell slots. And amulets like the Spellcrux Amulet and the Psychic Spark let you restore much higher level spell slots, and you also have the elixirs, the Potions of Angelic Reprieve, that can restore all of your level 1 and level 2 spell slots, if that's something that you particularly need to do. The Spell Savant Amulet, I think, is just too easily duplicated by super powerful effects, and isn't something that you're going to want to wear in combat. It takes a lot of fiddly micro to get the maximum benefit out of this. So while a level 2 spell slot isn't a totally useless resource, level 2 spell slots are still valuable in Act 3. There's a lot of other ways to get them that require less equipping and unequipping. I'm going to put it in C tier because you can use it if you're really dedicated to maximizing your adventuring days. The Tressym Collar. The Tressym Collar gives you telekinesis once per long rest. It's basically the same as the Hroknir bracers, which do the same thing as a glove slot, but an amulet slot you'll often be swapping out more often than your gloves anyways. So the Tressym Collar is another good way to get this effect, because telekinesis once per long rest is pretty powerful. Telekinesis is a good spell that's held back by the fact that it's so expensive to use. It's often not worth a 5th level spell slot, but when you don't have to spend that spell slot, then it suddenly becomes a much more interesting effect and a pretty powerful one to have access to. telekinesis for free is way, way better than telekinesis in exchange for an expensive resource. One of the themes of amulets, again, coming up with this item. And so the Tressym Collar is one that you can definitely swap in and use before swapping to a different amulet to gain a more passive benefit. That will let you do some pretty cool stuff in some encounters. Any encounter where telekinesis is good, which is a lot of them, any encounter with verticality or abysses or areas where you can throw enemies into hazards, you can use the Tressym Collar for good value. It's effectively free. All it costs you is your moral integrity as a person, and so the Tressym Collar is going to be A tier. And finally, the very last amulet in the game, the Unflinching Protector Amulet. The Unflinching Protector Amulet allows you to, once per short rest, when one of your allies is targeted by an attack, you can use your reaction to make that attack just miss. This is obviously excellent. As far as I can tell, there's no range on this effect, even though it says when a nearby ally is targeted. You can just use this whenever an ally is targeted in, I think, basically line of sight. So you get to use the Unflinching Protector Amulet pretty easily. And being able to turn a hit into a miss is one of the best things you can do. You get to see the roll before you have to decide whether to use this, so you can just turn off a critical hit. It's basically the level 10 illusion wizard feature, but available for your entire party instead of just the character wearing it. You want to put this typically on your highest armor class character, who can then defend their allies. Typically, the AI in Baldur's Gate will target low AC characters, so if your highest armor class character has this, they can then use their reaction to negate those attacks. You should use this on important attacks that you really want to negate, but the Unflinching Protector Amulet is just an awesome ability, extremely powerful, and gives you an amazing panic button when things are starting to go wrong. This adds a lot of extra safety to your party. Is it better than the other available amulets? It's going to depend pretty heavily on your party composition. If you have characters whose AC you just can't get to reasonable values, then equipping the Unflinching Protector Amulet on one of your more defensively oriented characters can really help shore up the weaknesses of those characters. And it just gives you a ton of safety. So for sort of safety-minded players, of which I myself am one often, the Unflinching Protector Amulet is an invaluable tool to help keep your party alive. I think I'm going to put it in A tier, because not every party is going to make great use of this item. Because if you have no characters with low AC, then this is much less necessary, and I do suggest that you attempt to build your parties so everyone has pretty high armor class. But the Unflinching Protector Amulet really can help prevent damage spikes, negate extremely dangerous individual attacks from enemies. It also works on any attacks, so spells that make attack rolls you can also negate with the Unflinching Protector Amulet. Overall, just adds a lot of safety to any party that's interested in using it, and is a pretty solid item. A tier. Alright, my friends, that is every amulet in the game. So taking a look at the amulets at the end of Act 3, I think most parties are going to be using the Amulet of Greater Health and the Amulet of the Devout. And then, of course, you'll be swapping in the Spellcrux Amulet in order to regain spells slots as appropriate, and probably still doing the same thing with the Pearl of Power. Depending on exactly how your party is composed, you may also have the Surgeon Subjugation Amulet, the Unflinching Protector Amulet, or the Spine Shudder Amulet, or just be using Khalid's Gift to give you an extra feat on any Wisdom-based character. Amulets, I think, are one of the best designed item slots in the game when you sort of look at them as a whole, because they are really variable and really interesting, and you're going to change which one you're using from encounter to encounter, from character to character, from moment to moment within the game. It's a much more, it's a item slot that has a lot more side grades, where the items are different in different situations, rather than strict improvements, like a lot of the other item slots have, where you end up with just one thing that's best in slot for every character, because amulets tend not to just be piles of stats, with the exception of the Amulet of Greater Health and the Amulet of the Devout, which, not coincidentally, are two of the best amulets. They tend to, moreover, give you interesting options for your characters, and allow you to do cool things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do because of how they shore up holes in your builds or your parties, enabling more unusual compositions without sacrificing too much, and I think that's a really interesting way for an item slot to behave and to interact with the game. As always, my friends, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit like, and of course, if you think there's something that I should move around here in this Amulet tier list, please do let me know. I have been very open to making changes before based on feedback that I receive. And so if you think that I am missing the point of one of these items, if I've misplaced something, definitely do let me know in the comments, because I'm always very open to changing my mind if you have a good reason for me to do so. As always, of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 tier lists and build guides and other strategy game analysis. And if you've really enjoyed the tier list, then consider becoming a channel member or leaving a thank you using the super thanks below, which I, of course, would really appreciate. Thank you, my friends, so much for watching, as always, and I will catch you next time.